Imagine a secret so profound that no one who knows it can ever speak without trembling. Imagine a woman in the sweltering swamps of 1876 Louisiana, whose belly grew heavy with life, yet time refused to follow the rules. 9 months stretched into years, and the world around her moved on, but she did not. She became a living anomaly, a ghost in daylight, a question no doctor, preacher, or neighbor could answer. And the more people whispered, the deeper the fear sank into their bones. Her name is lost to history, or perhaps it was erased. Only fragments remain, entries in tattered journals, half-remembered letters, and the faint, lingering memory of townsfolk who swore she carried a child for 7 years. 7 years where nothing moved but the passage of shadows across her face, a silent clock ticking against nature itself. In a time when the boundaries of science were crude and superstition ran like wildfire, her condition became a theater of terror and fascination. Doctors were baffled, clergy were fearful, and neighbors whispered of curses that might touch them if they dared to look too closely. But this is not just a story of medical impossibility. Look closer. Behind the stares and whispers, behind the veil of illness or miracle, there's something darker. A web of control, secrecy, and quiet manipulation. Think, how much power can a society wield over truth simply by refusing to acknowledge it? They didn't want her story known because the story itself threatened their sense of order. And make no mistake, the mechanisms that erased her, dismissed her, and turned her into a cautionary tale are still at work today, invisible yet omnipresent, governing what the world is allowed to see, what history can acknowledge, and who is permitted to speak. Tonight, we descend into the swampy heart of that secret. We will uncover the suppressed truths, the psychological pressures, the silent forces shaping perception and controlling reality. Every whisper, every stare, every year she carried life that should have been born. These are not anomalies. They are signs. Signs of a system that hides, manipulates, and punishes those who refuse to fit the narrative. By the end of this story, you will not only know her name, you will understand the machinery that tried to when her story first reached the parish records. It was treated as an inconvenience, an aberration that respectable men wanted tucked away, far from public eyes. But anomalies have a strange gravity. They pull at the fabric of order, stretching it, stressing it, revealing what lies beneath. And the deeper you examine her case, the more you realize this was never about medicine. It was about control, over truth, over fear, over the very boundaries of what a community was allowed to believe. She lived in a small wooden house on the edge of the bayou, surrounded by cypress knees rising from the water like skeletal fingers. Her belly, heavy and round, became a symbol of something no one could define. Was it a curse? A punishment? A sin? Or something far more disruptive? Evidence that the world obeyed laws far older than the institutions claiming authority over it. Doctors visited her, some quietly, some under pressure from church and state. They examined, scribbled, argued, then left with their faces pale and their conclusions buried in private notebooks that later vanished. They diagnosed nothing, not for lack of trying, but because nothing fit the frameworks they'd been taught. And that is where the fear began. A system survives by defining what is possible. When something emerges that defies definition, the system has two choices: expand the truth, or destroy the threat. Louisiana chose the latter. Neighbors were told she suffered from female delusions, a phrase used throughout the 19th century to silence women whose circumstances challenged authority. Pastors warned that speaking of her condition invited spiritual danger. Midwives who had witnessed her swelling body for years were suddenly discredited, dismissed as hysterical. Men who had been curious were warned to keep their distance. Over time, even those who believed her began to doubt themselves, not because her story changed, but because the system around them reshaped the narrative, inch by inch, until the impossible was no longer seen, no longer questioned, no longer spoken. That is the true machinery of silence, not force, but influence. Not threats, but suggestions. Not violence, but subtle psychological molding that folds the mind back into obedience. And through it all, she kept living, breathing, waiting, carrying a weight that defied explanation. Whether she wanted answers or simply wanted to be left alone is unknown. What is known is that the institutions around her, medical, religious, social, were not interested in truth. They were interested in containment. Tonight, you and I are going to do what they feared most. We are going to look directly at the truth they tried to bury. Imagine the hours, the days, the years stretching endlessly around her like the moss-draped oaks of the Louisiana bayou. Every sun that rose and set marked not a pregnancy of 9 months, but a life trapped in a loop, a body refusing to obey nature, a world pretending nothing was wrong. People came and went, whispered and stared, yet none dared to confront the possibility that her condition was a window, a mirror into a hidden structure of power and control. Consider the society around her, a web of rules, customs, and moral codes that claimed to protect, but in reality demanded conformity. This was a world where information was carefully curated, where anomalies were suppressed, and where fear was a tool more potent than any whip. Her existence, prolonged beyond natural law, was a crack in the foundation, a living threat to the authority of every doctor, priest, and official who relied on the predictability of the human body and human behavior. She became a study in isolation. Families avoided her home. Children whispered in fear of being cursed. Travelers crossed the street, muttering prayers. And yet, in that enforced solitude, there is a lesson that most will never see. The world does not crush the anomalous out of malice alone. It crushes it to maintain the illusion of control, to keep the collective mind obedient, to ensure that the unthinkable stays unspoken, unseen, and unremembered. But there is something crucial here, something the people of that time never realized. While they focused on her belly, her existence, her anomaly, they failed to notice that the real mystery was not her body. The real mystery was the machinery surrounding it, the invisible hand shaping perception, erasing evidence, rewriting narrative, and bending truth to maintain its dominion. And make no mistake, this machinery still exists. The same structures that silenced her then are active today. Quieter, smarter, more insidious. They dictate what knowledge is acceptable, what history is retold, what fear is legitimate. And if you are listening closely, you can feel their fingerprints on the edges of your own perception, guiding what you see, what you question, what you fear to explore. The woman who stayed 9 months pregnant for 7 years is not just a medical oddity. She is a symbol, a warning that systems will go to extraordinary lengths to maintain their grip. And it is only when you look beyond the anomaly, beyond the surface, that the true horror emerges, that reality itself is curated, filtered, and manipulated, and that every truth you've been told is negotiable, bendable, and sometimes entirely fabricated. If you are ready to go further, to peer deeper into the forces that shaped her fate and still shape ours, the next section will pull you into the shadows where history, psychology, and power converge. By the 3rd year, the whispers had grown louder, yet the world still pretended. Scholars, local magistrates, and curious travelers came seeking answers, but what they found instead was an invisible wall of obfuscation. Records vanished, testimony was dismissed, and anyone brave enough to speak openly risked social exile, or worse. Her body had become a mirror reflecting a deeper truth that society was terrified to acknowledge. The control over what is seen, what is spoken, and what is believed is absolute. Let that sink in. The anomaly itself was irrelevant. The true terror was the system surrounding it. Institutions, long thought benevolent, were not simply neutral observers. They were actors, deliberately shaping perception, curating fear, and enforcing silence. Every doctor who denied her, every priest who whispered warnings, every neighbor who turned away was a cog in a mechanism designed to erase inconvenient realities. And the same mechanism that erased her story then still exists today. Quieter, subtler, operating through narrative, law, and psychology, molding collective consciousness without a single raised hand. Her days became a study in endurance. Each morning, she awoke to a world that refused to acknowledge her existence as it truly was. Children, once curious, now fled in fear. Adults murmured excuses, rationalizations, anything to avoid confronting the impossible. And while she suffered physically, the psychological weight of isolation, scrutiny, and judgment was far more relentless. This is the part history rarely records, the suffering inflicted not by circumstance, but by society's insistence on controlling perception. Think about that. The pain of her body was real, but the terror of being unseen, disbelieved, and silenced is a horror that no physician could treat. She lived, pregnant not only with life, but with the unbearable weight of truth, while the world demanded she fit into a narrative crafted for comfort and control. And here lies a deeper pattern, one repeated across time, Whenever an individual disrupts accepted reality, through anomaly, insight, or revelation, they are punished not for what they do, but for what they expose. That is the system's survival strategy. Contain the anomaly, rewrite the story, erase the witnesses. It is subtle, invisible, and devastatingly effective. Now, if you are listening, understand this. Knowing her story is dangerous, not because of the anomaly itself, but because it exposes a universal principle about power, manipulation, and fear. By following her journey, you are walking down the path of forbidden knowledge, the kind that can never be unseen. We are halfway through the descent. At this point, comment twice below with the phrase, "I see the hidden hand." Write it, say it, internalize it. This is not ritual, this is recognition. This is how your mind begins to untangle the threads that the world has woven around you. By the 4th year, her existence had drifted into a realm no institution could afford to acknowledge. She was no longer seen as a woman, or a patient, or even a sinner. She had become something far more dangerous, a living contradiction. And contradictions, true contradictions, are catastrophic to any system built on rigid hierarchy and unquestioned authority. They must be isolated, discredited, or eliminated, because once a single exception is allowed to stand, the entire architecture of control begins to fracture. This is why the local parish began rewriting her identity long before they tried to rewrite her story. They called her unstable. They said grief had broken her mind. They blamed witchcraft, swamp fever, inherited female weakness, anything to redirect attention from the plain, undeniable reality that her condition defied every law they claimed to govern. The language they used was not diagnostic, it was strategic. Words became chains, tightening around her until the public no longer saw a human being, but an aberration unworthy of credibility. That is how psychological control operates, not through force, but through narrative, through carefully chosen labels, through the manipulation of perception so subtle that most people never realize their thoughts are not their own. And in 1876 Louisiana, this machinery was primitive but effective. Rumors spread faster than truth. Fear drowned out curiosity. Respectability silenced dissent. And all the while, the woman who carried life for 7 years continued to wait, trapped in a body that would not release her and a society that would not see her. But there was something else happening beneath the surface, something authorities did not anticipate. A handful of people began taking notes. Quiet observers, outsiders, skeptics who sensed that her case was more than an anomaly. These were men and women who understood power, who recognized the patterns of suppression, who saw the fingerprints of institutional fear all over her story. They were dismissed, ridiculed, threatened, but they continued to watch. And what they noticed over time was far more disturbing than the pregnancy itself. They noticed who kept showing up. The same doctors, the same clerics, the same government representatives, men who traveled miles to stand in her doorway, speak in whispers, examine her, then vanish without record. Men who claimed to represent public safety, spiritual guardianship, medical authority. Men who had no reason to care about a poor woman in the swamps, yet returned to her, year after year, like moths to a flame they feared but could not ignore. This is where the truth begins to split open. Because when institutions repeatedly visit what they publicly deny, it is never for compassion. It is for control. It is for containment. It is for the preservation of a narrative that must not be interrupted. In the next section, we enter the sealed corridors of those institutional forces, their motives, their fears, and the hidden agendas that made a single pregnant woman more dangerous than any weapon they'd ever known. What you must understand is this: the world she lived in was ruled not by law or morality, but by the unspoken fear of the unpredictable. Every official, every doctor, every priest who approached her did so with caution, not curiosity. Their visits were calculated, ritualized, performed to ensure that no truth could escape their control. And here's the terrifying part: they knew more than they revealed. Always. The documents that survive hint at observations that never reached print, measurements that were deliberately falsified, conclusions that were quietly discarded. This was no accident. History is full of anomalies, but only some are systematically buried. Only some are carefully manipulated into silence. That is the hallmark of power. Power does not simply crush anomalies. It co-opts them. It reframes them. It turns them into tools for obedience. And in the case of this woman, Her very body became a battleground, a contested space between life, law, and the machinery of suppression. It is likely that those who observed her over the years had ulterior motives we may never fully know. Were they measuring the impossible as part of an experiment? Were they cataloging her as proof of hidden natural laws or supernatural forces? Or were they simply attempting to assert dominion over something that terrified them? All we know is that their presence was relentless, ritualistic, and purposeful. Nothing about her existence was allowed to remain free of oversight. And yet, despite their control, she persisted. For 7 years, she carried a life that the world refused to acknowledge, a life that challenged every assumption about human biology, societal order, and institutional authority. The tension between her body and the forces surrounding her was a microcosm of every system of power that has ever existed, rigid, controlling, fearful of the unpredictable, and ruthless in maintaining the illusion of stability. This is the pattern you must recognize. Whenever a system perceives a threat to its authority, it mobilizes quietly, efficiently, and invisibly. It does not explain. It does not negotiate. It does not acknowledge. And it does not relent until the anomaly is neutralized, or, in rare cases, transformed into an instrument of compliance. Her story is a warning, not just about her fate, but about the forces that still operate around us. The world today functions with invisible overseers, institutions, narratives, cultural pressures that determine what you can know, what you can believe, and even what you are allowed to question. Understanding her story is not mere curiosity. It is an exercise in seeing the invisible machinery that surrounds your own life. In the next section, we will uncover the myths, rituals, and superstitions that were deliberately intertwined with her case, forces designed to confuse, manipulate, and ultimately control not just her, but everyone who dared to observe. By the 5th year, the story of her condition had twisted into something far more complex than fear or confusion. It had become a controlled myth, crafted deliberately, sharpened strategically, and deployed with precision. The institutions surrounding her understood something most people still fail to grasp. When truth is dangerous, you do not erase it outright. You dilute it. You distort it. You bury it under layers of superstition until the real signal is lost beneath manufactured noise. And so the myths began. Some said she'd been cursed by an old midwife whose child she refused to nurse. Others claimed she'd conceived under a blood moon, sealing her womb in a supernatural cycle. Preachers whispered that her unborn child was a demon suspended in time. Doctors, unable to explain her case scientifically, invented pathologies that never existed, phantom pregnancies, delusional cycles, swamp-induced madness. Every story contradicted the last, but that inconsistency was the point. Confusion is a weapon of power. When a population is confused, exhausted, and overwhelmed by conflicting narratives, it becomes pliable, directionless, easy to shepherd. And in 1876 Louisiana, this strategy worked flawlessly. No one knew what to believe, so the people stopped asking questions altogether. Even the curious grew weary of trying to separate truth from superstition. They surrendered to the official narrative. She was an outlier, a danger, an woman whose condition threatened the moral and spiritual order of the parish. But behind closed doors, those same institutions propagated rituals, strange, quiet, private, that had nothing to do with God or medicine. Priests brought her objects wrapped in cloth, relics from older traditions never spoken of in sermons. Physicians performed examinations that resembled rites more than diagnostics, measuring her pulse while chanting under their breath. Government agents took soil samples around her home, measured humidity, catalogued fungi, insects, water quality, yet published none of it. It was as if they were trying to decode something ancient, something they feared, something they wanted to control before it controlled them. To the outside world, superstition was a distraction, but internally, superstition was a shield, a convenient tool to conceal the real operations beneath. While the townsfolk argued whether she was cursed or delusional, the institutions were free to conduct their quiet investigations unchecked. Understand this: myths are never accidental. They are deployed. They are engineered. They are the first layer of psychological insulation that protects the powerful from scrutiny. And in her case, the myths became so dense, so pervasive, that the truth nearly disappeared beneath them. Nearly. Because a few people, very few, noticed the inconsistencies. They noticed the men in positions of authority who visited her at night, not day. They noticed the strange symbols drawn on the floorboards after priests left. They noticed the way animals refused to approach her home in the final years. They noticed the quiet tension between institutions that normally cooperated without conflict. These anomalies suggest something deeper, older, and far more dangerous than superstition. By the 6th year, her home had ceased to be a dwelling. It had become a boundary line, an invisible frontier where the rational world ended and something older began. You must understand, institutions do not linger around an anomaly for 6 years unless they believe the anomaly grants access to knowledge they cannot ignore. And in her case, they hovered like predators circling prey they did not fully understand. There are references, buried in private journals, unsigned letters, and confiscated parish documents, to something the officials called the stillness phenomenon, a state in which life persists without progression, in which time interacts with the body in ways outside the conventional flow. They believed, quietly and privately, that her condition was a doorway, one that hinted at ancient systems of biology and spirit long dismissed as folklore. And this is where the truth fractures into forbidden territory, because beneath the surface of their scientific examinations, beneath the pious rituals they pretended were blessings, there existed a second layer of intention. They wanted to harness whatever force had suspended her womb in defiance of nature. Not cure it, not explain it, not exorcise it. Use it, control it, weaponize it. There are symbols recorded on the floor of her home, markings not found in Christian liturgy, but traced back to pre-colonial rites from West Africa, Caribbean spirit traditions, and older European occult systems. Whoever inscribed them knew exactly what they were doing. These were not random superstitions. They were invocations, methods of communication or containment, attempts to manipulate the unknown. And silently, without her consent, she became the centerpiece of a hidden study, one that crossed scientific boundaries, spiritual taboos, and political authority. She was no longer a woman. She was a vessel, a living experiment incubating a secret they wanted, but could not define. This is why the institutions did not move against one another, despite their conflicting beliefs. Science, church, and state rarely cooperate, but around her, they did. That is the clearest sign that something extraordinary was unfolding. They shared notes. They shared suspicions. They shared faith. And most of all, they shared the desperate desire to conceal what they were probing. Because if the public ever understood that the anomaly inside her represented something beyond biological failure, something that challenged their understanding of time, spirit, and natural law, their authority would collapse. The crowd would no longer bow to institutions that clearly did not possess the knowledge they claimed. Her body was the pressure point, the hinge between worlds, a threat to the illusion of mastery that every empire depends upon. Those few independent observers, teachers, travelers, skeptics, started connecting dots. They documented unusual patterns in temperature, strange pulses in the air around her home, the absence of insects, the shifts in animal behavior. They reported a stillness so heavy it felt like stepping underwater. Whatever force lay at the heart of her suspended pregnancy was not passive. It radiated. It influenced. It watched. By the 7th year, her existence had entered the realm of legend, but one crafted not by imagination, but by careful, intentional concealment. The anomaly she embodied was no longer a matter of curiosity or superstition. It had become a locus of power, observed by men who understood that controlling her was controlling something far larger than a single human life. Something older. Something the world had forgotten how to name. The records that survive hint at measurements, charts, and diagrams that make no sense in conventional medicine. Heartbeats recorded at impossible rhythms. Fetal movements that could not be explained by biology. Hours when light behaved differently in her room. Shadows stretching or shrinking against natural laws. Animals reacting not to her presence, but to something she carried within. And the observers, those men of authority, meticulously documented every detail, not to heal, not to save, but to comprehend, manipulate, and contain. Here is the critical truth. History does not preserve anomalies. It preserves the stories that power allows. The story of this woman survived only in fragments because the forces around her recognized that full understanding would undo the authority of every institution claiming knowledge. Imagine if people had known the extent of what she carried, the stillness, the unnatural time, the force radiating from her womb. Civil, religious, and medical authorities would have crumbled in the face of evidence they could neither deny nor control. And yet, they persisted. They returned again and again, conducting examinations under the guise of piety and science, performing rituals veiled as procedures. They tested boundaries, observed reactions, and recorded anomalies. Some notes suggest a recognition that her body, suspended between life and the impossible, had become a portal, a conduit to understanding forces that had shaped civilizations in ways long forgotten. Consider what that implies. That the world, then as now, is run not by transparent systems of knowledge, but by hidden custodians of forbidden truths. They decide what anomalies are acknowledged, what patterns are recognized, and what knowledge is permitted to exist. They operate in silence, wielding subtle influence, shaping perception, and erasing those who threaten the narrative. And she, this woman who carried life for 7 years, became their unwilling teacher, not through consent, but through the very fact of her anomaly. Every day, every year, every breath she took was a demonstration. Reality is mutable, and authority is fragile when confronted with forces it does not understand. The people around her, the observers, the skeptics, the few who dared to record, began to understand that this was not a pregnancy in the ordinary sense. Something else had manifested. Something outside conventional biology, history, and morality. Something that defied containment, yet had become the target of containment itself. By the 8th year, the woman's life had become a tension point, an invisible battlefield where human authority clashed with forces older than law or science. Her neighbors had long stopped speaking of her openly. The few outsiders who dared to observe did so quietly, fearful of what her anomaly represented. And the authorities, churchmen, doctors, even local officials, moved with precision, knowing that every misstep could allow a truth to leak that might unravel the careful control they had maintained for 7 years. Her body, still carrying life in defiance of natural law, had become a repository of observation, speculation, and silent fear. But what was truly terrifying, and what history almost entirely omits, is the psychological weight she bore. Each day was a crucible, the constant intrusion, the whispers behind closed doors, the ritualized examinations that masked curiosity as care. Time itself became a weapon. The passage of years, while outwardly monotonous, was inwardly an unrelenting pressure, bending perception, eroding certainty, and forcing her into isolation not by choice, but by invisible decree. And yet, even amid the relentless scrutiny, she persisted. The anomaly endured. And this endurance is key to understanding why history feared her. Because the longer an anomaly survives, the harder it is to ignore. The longer truth defies containment, the more vulnerable every system of authority becomes. That is why her story was actively distorted, mythologized, and weaponized against the observers themselves. Myths were created to confuse, rituals performed to control, records destroyed to erase. Everything that survived is fragmentary. Yet in those fragments lies a pattern, a blueprint of how systems of control operate when confronted by the impossible. By now, anyone who studies her life must confront a chilling reality. This is not a story about pregnancy. It is a story about power, fear, and knowledge, the machinery that governs perception and enforces obedience. Every act of erasure, every whisper of superstition, every ritualized visit was designed to maintain dominance over what society could not comprehend. And for those who notice the pattern today, the implications are profound. Institutions, narratives, and even cultural norms are carefully engineered to obscure truths that would disrupt the illusion of control. And yet, the anomaly persisted. Through years of observation, manipulation, and ritual, the woman survived. A living proof that some forces cannot be contained by fear, by ritual, or by authority. That life, particularly anomalous life, can endure beyond expectation, beyond comprehension, and beyond the systems designed to dominate it. By the 9th year, her existence had become an intersection of suffering, revelation, and forbidden observation. What few witnesses had dared to study her began to document changes that went beyond the physical. Her voice carried strange cadences. Her eyes reflected rhythms of time that seemed imperceptible to ordinary people, and a perception of reality. Her awareness expanded into a realm the observers could not penetrate. She had become more than a human being. She had become a vessel of knowledge that institutions feared, coveted, and could not control. The cost to her mind was immense. 7 years of suspended pregnancy was only the safest. Beneath it, the psychological strain created an isolation unlike anything recorded in conventional history. Time itself lost meaning. Days, months, and years blended into one another, yet each second was weighted with the presence of authority, watchful, analyzing, controlling. Even sleep brought no refuge. Dreams became a liminal space where observers' rituals replayed endlessly, and where her body communicated a truth that science and superstition alike could not name. The observers, doctors, priests, and officials, were meticulous. They tracked her heartbeat, pulse, respiration, and the minute changes in her body as if documenting a celestial event. Every anomaly was logged, every reaction noted, every movement catalogued. Yet even as they sought to control her, they unwittingly confirmed her autonomy. Her anomaly was not something they could fully harness. It was a force resisting containment, a living challenge to the systems they depended on to maintain order. And there were signs that something else had emerged during those 7 years. Symbols etched in her home, subtle patterns in the local wildlife, fluctuations in light and air, phenomena the few brave observers could not explain. They hinted at a hidden network of forces interacting with her body. Forces that connected biology, consciousness, and time itself in ways modern science still struggles to comprehend. Those who recorded the phenomena did so cautiously, knowing that exposure would provoke ridicule, legal action, or worse. Yet through all of this, she endured. Her persistence became an unspoken accusation against authority. No matter how tightly they controlled narrative, no matter how fiercely they manipulated perception, some truths cannot be erased. They persist in silence, in shadow, in memory. This is why her story is more than an anomaly. It is a blueprint for understanding hidden power, for recognizing the invisible hands that shape what we accept as reality. The lesson is clear. The world is far more malleable than we are taught, and the structures we trust are maintained as much through fear and control as through reason. As the 7th year drew to a close, the woman's life had become a crucible in which the invisible forces of power, fear, and observation converged. Every moment of her suspended pregnancy was a demonstration of endurance and resistance, a challenge to the authority of every doctor, priest, and official who sought to contain her. Yet it was also a warning. Anomalies are never isolated. They reveal the fragility of systems, the cracks in control, and the lengths institutions will go to maintain dominance over perception. Her body, mind, and very presence became a testing ground. What the observers recorded, heart rhythms, patterns of light, changes in temperature, and strange biological reactions, were carefully guarded. Their notes, their journals, their letters were hidden from public view. Only fragments remain today, but even in those fragments is a pattern, a deliberate effort to understand and manipulate forces beyond conventional knowledge. In other words, she was never just a woman carrying a child. She was an experiment in time, biology, and control, a living instrument in the hands of those who knew how to exploit anomalies for their own agendas. And yet, the cost to her was immeasurable. Years of isolation, scrutiny, and ritual left scars not only on her body but on her mind. Memory and perception began to shift. She learned to anticipate the observers, to read the patterns of their visits, to navigate the subtle rituals they imposed. Her consciousness expanded into a heightened awareness that blurred the boundaries between herself, the forces around her, and the observers she had learned to manipulate in return. What happened inside her home, in the silent hours, was never recorded fully. We know only that something changed, something the outside world never understood. Shadows moved differently. Air pulsed with unseen currents. Animals, both wild and domestic, avoided her presence, reacting not to her as a human but to what she had become, a node of energy, a locus of something older and deeper than natural law. This is where history fails most dramatically. It wants to see her as an oddity, a medical curiosity, a cautionary tale. But she was none of those things. She was a living testament to forces hidden in plain sight, forces that shape institutions, manipulate perception, and enforce obedience. The people who tried to study her were themselves caught in the orbit of those forces, even as they pretended mastery over her condition. Her story is a mirror. It asks questions we are rarely taught to ask. Who controls knowledge? Who defines reality? How far will systems go to contain the inconvenient, the unexplainable, the threatening? And most importantly, if a single human being could survive 7 years suspended in defiance of natural law, what else might exist, unnoticed, in the shadows around us? When the 7th year ended, the woman's story did not conclude in the way outsiders expected. There were no dramatic announcements, no public explanations, no medical declarations. The observers vanished quietly, their notes confiscated or hidden, their findings scattered across private journals that would resurface only in fragments decades later. And she became a ghost within her own life, seen, whispered about, studied, yet never truly acknowledged. The final months were marked by a strange, almost ritualized stillness. Visitors entered less frequently, and when they did, their presence was cautious, tentative, as if they feared that any misstep could awaken forces they could no longer predict. The anomalies persisted. Her heartbeat remained irregular. Her body remained suspended in its unnatural cycle, and the phenomena around her home, the shifting shadows, the absence of insects, the avoidance of animals, continued unchecked. It became apparent to the few who were watching that this was no ordinary pregnancy, no conventional anomaly. Something far older, far more enduring, had taken root. And then, abruptly, the attention ceased. Journals stopped mid-sentence. Records vanish. Institutions that had been monitoring her for years simply moved on. But the silence was deliberate. They did not move on because the anomaly had ended. They moved on because they could no longer explain it, could not contain it, and understood that exposure would destabilize the authority they had meticulously built. Her story was consigned to fragments, whispers, and myth, an anomaly deliberately erased from the orderly narrative of history. Yet the imprint remained. Anyone with the courage to sift through the remnants can see the pattern, the intersection of human authority with forces it does not understand, and the extreme lengths taken to preserve the illusion of control. Her life, her endurance, her anomaly, all served as a living indictment of the institutions that surrounded her. It is a stark lesson in the limits of power, the fragility of control, and the quiet, invisible methods by which reality is curated, manipulated, and, when necessary, erased. Consider what that means for us today. Every system that dictates perception, governments, educational institutions, religious authorities, even cultural norms, operates on similar principles. Anomalies are contained, inconvenient truths are suppressed, and knowledge that challenges established narratives is systematically buried. And just like in 1876 Louisiana, the machinery is invisible, subtle, and terrifyingly effective. Her story endures not as a medical curiosity, but as a warning. It asks us to recognize the hidden forces around us, to question the reality presented as absolute, and to acknowledge that some truths are so dangerous they are erased before you even know they existed. The suspended pregnancy of this woman was more than a biological anomaly. It was a symbol, a prism through which the hidden machinery of power and control becomes visible. Think about it. 7 years of defying natural law, observed, studied, and manipulated by authorities who feared her very existence. What does that tell us about the nature of control? That it is not always brute force. Often, it is subtler, more insidious, a quiet, relentless shaping of perception, a containment of reality itself. Her anomaly functioned as a mirror, reflecting back the strategies societies used to manage fear, uncertainty, and the unknown. People fear what they cannot categorize. Institutions fear what cannot be codified. And so, in the absence of understanding, stories are rewritten, observations are suppressed, and the anomalous is transformed into myth. Every whispered legend about her in the years that followed, the curses, the superstitions, the impossible claims, was part of a system designed to absorb the threat, to neutralize the truth, and to ensure obedience. And here's the subtle, psychological lesson. Control does not need to be violent to be effective. The town, the church, the doctors, the officials, all exercised influence through suggestion, fear, and narrative. Silence became their weapon. Rumor became their shield. Observation became their lever. She endured in defiance, but the system surrounding her demonstrated how reality itself can be regulated when the population accepts the narrative without question. Now, consider the symbolic weight of the pregnancy itself. A gestation that refuses to conclude is a metaphor for suspended potential, delayed revelation, and the distortion of time under pressure. It is a warning that knowledge, power, and life can be manipulated, observed, and prolonged or suppressed according to the will of the unseen custodians of control. Every heartbeat she carried, every shadow in her home, every year that passed, these were measures of influence, not just physiology. By internalizing her story, you are witnessing a profound lesson in how systems operate in secrecy, how human perception can be guided, and how anomalies are both feared and studied by those in power. The anomaly itself is secondary. The real lesson is the network, the hidden, methodical, and omnipresent forces that determined how the world could perceive her, and how much of the truth could survive. At this point, comment "I see the hidden hand" twice. Do it. Say it aloud or write it in the comments. This is more than engagement. It is a symbolic acknowledgement that your mind is beginning to recognize the structures that shape perception and control reality. By the final years of her anomalous pregnancy, the rituals surrounding her became almost as important as her physical condition. Visits from doctors, priests, and officials followed patterns so precise they were indistinguishable from ceremonies. Notes describe repeated measures, strange symbols, whispered incantations, and objects placed methodically around her home. To the outside observer, these were acts of care or superstition. To those who understood, they were tools of containment, a way to study and control a phenomenon too dangerous to confront openly. Ritual, in this context, was a mechanism of authority. It created the illusion of understanding while simultaneously exerting psychological pressure on the anomaly itself and the community observing it. Every movement, every gesture, every carefully timed visit was designed to shape perception. Silence became as powerful as speech. The subtle threat of misbehavior, of questioning, of doubting, ensured compliance. Fear, carefully managed, allowed the system to operate unchecked. The psychological impact on her cannot be overstated. To live under constant observation, where every gesture is interpreted and every anomaly is dissected, is to exist in a suspended reality. Her autonomy, already under siege by the unnatural pregnancy, was further constrained by ritualized oversight. Every person who entered her home, every note taken, every whispered consultation, reinforced the authority of systems beyond her comprehension. She became an unwilling participant in a prolonged experiment in power and obedience. And yet, even amid such control, she endured. The anomaly persisted. Her body, mind, and presence became a silent counterpoint to the authority attempting to dominate her. This is the paradox of observation. The more the system tries to contain, the more evidence it inadvertently produces of its own fragility. The anomaly exposes the mechanisms of control even as it is subjected to them. This duality, of power attempting domination and anomaly resisting it, is the heart of her story. It is a blueprint for understanding how influence operates in secrecy, how rituals enforce obedience without overt violence, and how fear is manufactured and sustained across generations. Now, recognize this pattern. Every institution, every authority structure, every hidden system you encounter today relies on the same principles. Observation, ritual, subtle coercion, and narrative manipulation are the levers that maintain control. Her story, though centuries old, reveals the machinery in action, hidden yet omnipresent. By the time her 7th year of suspended pregnancy had passed, the community had developed a strange duality toward her. She was both feared and fascinated, shunned and observed, pitied and mythologized. This duality was not accidental, it was cultivated. Fear alone is rarely enough to control a population. Fascination amplifies it. It draws attention, curiosity, and energy toward the anomaly, ensuring that the observer becomes complicit in the very system they fear. The townsfolk whispered, speculated, and watched from a distance, feeding the invisible architecture of control. Gossip became a tool to maintain social boundaries. A child warned not to approach her, a neighbor reminded to cross the street, a visitor told to avoid discussion. And in these daily interactions, the anomaly served a dual purpose. It was a spectacle that entertained, a mystery that intrigued, and a mechanism that enforced obedience without overt violence. This is a critical pattern that repeats across history, the combination of fear and fascination. Societies magnify anomalies not to understand them, but to keep control over them and over the observers. When people are both terrified and intrigued, their attention is captured, their judgment clouded, and their perception malleable. It is the perfect environment for hidden forces to operate unchecked. She became, in effect, a mirror. Every whisper about her reflected the anxieties of the community. Every glance she drew reinforced patterns of obedience. Every story told about her condition reinforced the narrative the authorities wanted to preserve. The anomaly was never merely a biological curiosity. It was a living instrument, mediating the balance between fear, fascination, and control. And yet, she endured. While the town was caught in its collective reaction, her body persisted, her anomaly continued, and the forces surrounding her remained unaware of one truth. Persistence is a form of resistance. Every day she survived, every year she bore the weight of the impossible, was a quiet defiance of the systems attempting to dominate her. Her life illustrates a universal principle. Authority relies on narratives, perception, and subtle manipulation. The anomalies that challenge those narratives, whether individuals, ideas, or phenomena, are not eliminated outright. They are contained, controlled, mythologized, and observed until the population forgets to question the boundaries of reality itself. Behind closed doors, the scientific and spiritual investigations into her condition took on a life of their own. These were not the perfunctory visits of curious doctors or concerned clergy. These were meticulously orchestrated operations, repeated year after year, with the same observers, the same instruments, and the same rituals. The few notes that survive describe measurements that defy conventional explanation. Her pulse accelerated and decelerated in patterns that suggested an awareness beyond her conscious control. Her body emitted heat and electrical charges inconsistent with known biology, and light in her room behaved unpredictably, casting shadows that seemed almost sentient. The priests involved did not merely pray, they invoked phrases, traced symbols, and arranged objects that did not align with sanctioned Christian practice. Scholars who examined surviving documents noted the use of obscure signs from African and European esoteric traditions, combined in a manner suggesting a deliberate attempt to probe or contain whatever force existed within her. The spiritual and scientific efforts converged on one shared goal: to understand, catalog, and, if possible, control the anomaly. Every procedure, every ritual, every observation was carefully recorded in private journals. These were never published, and most were destroyed, yet fragments reveal a terrifying clarity. Those in authority understood that what they were dealing with was not just a prolonged pregnancy, but a phenomenon that connected time, consciousness, and physical reality in ways they could neither fully explain nor predict. The anomaly itself was a challenge, a puzzle, and a threat all at once. And this is the chilling truth: the anomaly was never studied for compassion or curiosity alone. It was studied for power. Those observing her were attempting to harness, manipulate, and ultimately dominate forces they did not understand. They sought control over something that had already transcended human expectation: the suspension of time, the persistence of life beyond natural limits, the manifestation of forces older than the recorded history they claimed to preserve. This is the lesson hidden in plain sight. Systems of authority, religious, scientific, and governmental, operate in the shadows, investigating, containing, and sometimes exploiting anomalies that threaten their narrative. The deeper you look, the more patterns emerge, and the more apparent it becomes that history is curated, knowledge is filtered, and truth is rarely allowed to survive intact. 7 years of constant observation is more than a physical ordeal. It is a psychological crucible. Imagine waking each day under the scrutiny of unseen forces, aware that every movement, every word, every glance could be interpreted, catalogued, or weaponized. Her mind, like her body, was under siege. There was no sanctuary, no reprieve. Sleep offered little relief, because even in dreams, the rituals and visits replayed, embedding themselves into the rhythm of her consciousness. The weight of surveillance was relentless. Every visitor brought expectation. Every whispered measurement carried judgment. Time itself became an instrument of control. Days blurred, years stretched unnaturally, and her perception of reality shifted. What begins as an anomaly in the body quickly becomes an anomaly in the mind. She learned to anticipate the observers, to read subtle patterns in their behavior, and to navigate the rituals imposed upon her with increasing acuity. Her awareness expanded, heightened by necessity, evolving into a form of intelligence that could see beyond the superficial order the authorities tried to maintain. And yet, within this expansion lay the first forms of subtle resistance. She began to manipulate the observers without overt action. A shift of posture, a subtle expression, a heartbeat intentionally altered at key moments, small, almost imperceptible acts that asserted autonomy in a situation designed to strip it away. The anomaly in her body became a tool, her endurance a message, that no matter how much authority sought to dominate, there existed a domain within herself that could not be fully controlled. This is the hidden pattern we must recognize. The anomaly and the observer exist in a dynamic tension. Authority seeks control, anomaly resists, and the mind becomes the battlefield. Her psychological evolution, the development of hyper-awareness, subtle influence, and silent defiance, is a blueprint for understanding resistance within systems of power. Even when institutions dominate, individuals can exert influence through perception, timing, and subtle action. Her mind, in other words, became as anomalous as her body. And that is why the story of the woman who stayed pregnant for 7 years matters. It is not only a story of biology, ritual, and authority. It is a story of awareness, resistance, and the quiet assertion of autonomy against overwhelming control. By the conclusion of her 7th year, the pattern of surveillance, ritual, and subtle manipulation reached its apex, and then, almost inexplicably, it ceased. The authorities who had watched, measured, and catalogued her every day disappeared from her life. Doctors stopped visiting. Priests no longer entered her home. Local officials vanished quietly, leaving no trace of their observations, no explanation for the sudden absence of oversight. And the records? Most were destroyed, some hidden, a few scattered fragments surviving by accident. The machinery that had governed her reality, so precise, so unrelenting, had evaporated, leaving only silence. But the silence itself was deliberate. It was not absence, it was containment. The disappearance of observers and records ensured that the anomaly could not be fully understood, reported, or analyzed. Without witnesses, without documentation, without context, the story became myth. Communities would whisper legends, cursed pregnancies, prolonged gestation, impossible life. And yet, beneath the mythology, the real lesson persisted, the ineffable truth of her endurance, and the systems that tried and failed to dominate it. This is the method by which history often conceals dangerous knowledge. Anomalies are not always crushed, sometimes they are rendered invisible. Evidence is suppressed, narratives are rewritten, and the extraordinary is buried under layers of mundane explanation. And those who attempt to record or question are marginalized, discredited, or erased. The machinery of control is as much about shaping memory as it is about controlling action. Her case exemplifies this principle perfectly. The anomaly, the pregnancy that refused to conclude, was extraordinary enough to attract attention, fear, and intervention. But the disappearance of records, the withdrawal of observers, and the cultivation of myth ensured that ordinary society would never confront the reality of what had occurred. Knowledge was contained, perception was managed, and authority remained unchallenged. And yet, the fragments that survived, the whispers, the letters, the journals, the few remaining notes, reveal a consistent pattern. The anomaly endured, but the system tried to erase it. The anomaly resisted, but the system adjusted, creating a narrative in which the impossible could be acknowledged only in shadow and myth. The symbolic weight of her 7-year pregnancy extends far beyond the bayous of Louisiana. It is a prism through which we can examine the invisible structures of power, control, and perception that operate in every society. Her anomaly was never just biological. It was psychological, social, and spiritual. Every observer, every ritual, every whisper served as a mechanism to shape perception, enforce obedience, and obscure truth. And in surviving all of it, she exposed the limits of authority, even in its most methodical forms. Consider the psychology of her community. Fear and fascination became intertwined, ensuring that ordinary people did not challenge authority or seek understanding. The anomaly was rendered a spectacle, a cautionary tale, a story to pass along, but never a reality to confront. In this, we see the same mechanisms at work today. Narratives are curated, inconvenient truths are buried, and anomalies are dismissed or mythologized to maintain social cohesion and institutional dominance. The more extraordinary the truth, the more effort is expended to contain it. Her survival, however, challenges the very notion of containment. 7 years of suspended pregnancy is not only an anomaly in physiology, it is a lesson in endurance, awareness, and resistance. In enduring the unthinkable, she demonstrated that life and consciousness possess a resilience that authority cannot fully suppress. And this resilience is precisely what history often tries to erase, the subtle defiance of the individual against systems designed to control perception and behavior. There is also a spiritual dimension. The rituals, symbols, and esoteric methods employed by the observers suggest that her condition intersected with forces older than medicine, religion, or law, forces that demand respect and caution. This intersection of biology, consciousness, and the ineffable is a reminder that anomalies are not always threats to be neutralized. They are gateways to hidden understanding, portals to truths that society fears but cannot ignore. Her story is, in essence, a blueprint for awareness. It shows how systems of control operate through observation, ritual, narrative, and faith. It teaches the psychological mechanisms of containment. It exposes the limits of authority, and it reminds us that some truths, though buried, persist beyond suppression, myth, or erasure. The paradox of her survival is profound. For 7 years, she was the subject of relentless observation, measurement, and ritual. Yet in enduring, she became something far more dangerous than any anomaly her observers could categorize. She became a silent teacher, demonstrating the limits of authority and the fragility of control. Every calculation, every ritual, every note they took was testament to their fascination and their faith that they could never fully dominate her. Consider this: those who observed her wielded power over the narrative, over perception, and over access to information. They were doctors, priests, and officials, men trained to command respect and enforce obedience. Yet in the presence of her anomaly, they were not masters. They were witnesses. Their meticulous records, their rituals, their measurements, were all attempts to understand something that defied conventional frameworks. In trying to control her, they revealed their own limitations. Her subtle power was in endurance and awareness. She learned the patterns of their visits, the timing of rituals, and the cadence of whispered notes. Without open defiance, without overt action, she asserted control over the system observing her. She became a mirror, reflecting back the insecurity, fear, and obsession of those who believed themselves in command. In this way, the anomaly was not merely a biological curiosity. It was an instrument of insight, a demonstration that authority is always provisional, contingent upon perception, and vulnerable when confronted with the extraordinary. This is a lesson hidden in plain sight. Power can be terrifying, pervasive, and seemingly absolute, but it is never omnipotent. Even the most meticulously designed systems fail when confronted with persistence, awareness, and the unknown. Her existence forced those who claimed authority to confront what they could not control, and in doing so, revealed the invisible scaffolding of fear and narrative that supports every institution. And the final irony is this: the very observers who sought to suppress her, control her, and study her became unwitting participants in her demonstration. Their fascination, their fear, and their meticulous notes were evidence of her subtle dominance, proof that even the powerful are vulnerable when they confront the unknown. Once the observers withdrew and the formal study ceased, the anomaly did not vanish. It was transformed into myth. Stories spread through the town and surrounding regions, each retelling distorted by fear, imagination, and intentional manipulation. Some claimed she was cursed by the devil. Others whispered that her child was a demon, suspended in her womb until the end of time. Preachers warned that her condition was punishment for sins no one could name. Every story served a purpose: to obscure reality while preserving control. This is the essence of myth-making as a tool of authority. When an event or person defies understanding, societies rarely confront it directly. Instead, they cloak it in narrative, superstition, or legend, ensuring that the anomaly becomes a cautionary tale rather than evidence of a force beyond comprehension. In her case, myth became a containment strategy. The public's fascination ensured that attention remained focused on stories, not truth. Fear ensured compliance, and imagination replaced observation. Even fragments of surviving documentation reflect this. Letters describe observers instructing locals to speak only in riddles or avoid inquiry. Priests wrote coded references to the womb that time forgot, while doctors hid notes behind layers of false terminology. The myth was engineered, consciously and unconsciously, to suppress understanding. Ordinary people accepted the stories because they provided comfort, explanation, or entertainment. But beneath the surface, the truth persisted, quietly resisting erasure. This process is repeated across history, even today. Those who hold authority recognize that raw truth is dangerous, especially when it challenges fundamental assumptions. They control perception through narrative, ritual, and myth, ensuring anomalies are either absorbed into legend or dismissed entirely. The woman's 7-year pregnancy is a perfect example. The extraordinary was not erased. It was transformed, making it manageable, digestible, and, most importantly, non-threatening to existing systems of power. And yet, myth cannot entirely contain reality. The fragments that survived, the whispers that persisted, the subtle evidence left behind, all point to something far more profound than superstition. The anomaly endured, not as a spectacle, but as demonstration of forces that authority cannot fully control, a reminder that some truths are too resilient to be contained by narrative alone. Myth and memory have a curious relationship. Myth obscures truth, but memory preserves fragments, tiny sparks that survive suppression, distortion, and erasure. In the case of the woman who carried life for 7 years, memory became the vessel through which fragments of forbidden knowledge persisted. Oral accounts, private letters, and surviving journals contain hints of phenomena that ordinary society could neither explain nor tolerate. They are traces of a reality that continues to challenge authority long after the events themselves have passed. The interplay of myth and memory demonstrates a central truth. The more an anomaly threatens perception, the more energy systems of power invest in shaping the narrative. Legends were crafted to frighten, distract, and confuse. Memory, however, is harder to suppress, especially when witnessed by those who perceive patterns invisible to the casual observer. Memory becomes a silent form of resistance, a repository of truths too inconvenient to be recognized publicly, but too powerful to be destroyed entirely. In her case, memory preserved the tension between natural law and the anomaly she embodied. People remembered how shadows behaved in her home, how animals avoided her presence, how light and temperature shifted unpredictably. Even those who did not understand the significance retained a sense of unease, a tacit acknowledgement that something beyond comprehension had existed. The observers themselves, despite their authority, could not entirely erase the memory of what they had witnessed. And here's the lesson for those who seek understanding today. Anomalies are preserved not only through evidence but through attention and perception. Memory acts as a hidden ledger of resistance against the mechanisms of control. Every time the story is remembered, retold, or reflected upon, it becomes active again, subtly undermining the narratives imposed by authority and revealing patterns of suppression, manipulation, and fear. This is why her story endures. It continues to teach, to provoke awareness, and to illuminate the invisible levers of power. Myth may cloak the anomaly, but memory and perception carry the truth forward, waiting for those willing to see the structures behind the spectacle. Her anomaly is not just an isolated historical curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting the dynamics of control that permeate every society. What occurred in Louisiana in 1876 was not merely a medical or spiritual event. It was a demonstration of how systems of authority operate when confronted with the impossible. Institutions, from religious bodies to medical authorities to local government, responded predictably. Observation, ritual, suppression, and narrative control. The anomaly threatened comprehension, and when comprehension fails, power resorts to containment. Fear and fascination were the dual levers employed. The townsfolk were terrified by the unknown, captivated by the spectacle, and ultimately neutralized by their own curiosity. Authority capitalized on these emotions, shaping perception to enforce obedience without overt coercion. Every ritual, every whispered legend, every recorded measurement served as a mechanism to channel attention, manipulate belief, and prevent challenge to the system. In other words, the anomaly was not only studied, it was weaponized psychologically. The broader implication is profound. Any system that seeks control, whether historical or modern, operates on similar principles. Anomalies, inconvenient truths, and threats to narrative coherence are managed not through confrontation alone, but through subtle manipulation of perception. Surveillance, storytelling, ritual, and myth are all tools used to maintain authority, ensuring the population interprets reality in a way that preserves existing power structures. Her persistence, her endurance, and her subtle resistance reveal another layer, that power, no matter how methodical, is never absolute. Even under constant observation and ritualized containment, she exerted influence simply by existing. Her anomaly exposed the limits of authority, demonstrated the fragility of constructed reality, and left traces of truth that could not be fully erased. This is the insight that history often hides. The extraordinary cannot be fully contained, but systems of control will attempt it. And understanding these dynamics allows the observer, those willing to see beyond myth and narrative, to recognize the invisible levers of power in their own lives, to recognize where fear, fascination, and perception are manipulated, and to reclaim agency over what they choose to believe, observe, and remember. Knowledge is power. This is a lesson exemplified perfectly by the case of the woman who carried a pregnancy for 7 years. Every observer, doctors, priests, officials, understood this instinctively. To control her anomaly, they needed to control understanding itself. Measurements, rituals, and observations were not purely scientific or spiritual. They were acts of monopolizing knowledge. Whoever controlled the information controlled perception, and whoever controlled perception controlled reality, at least in the eyes of society. The system surrounding her functioned like a fortress, with information as its currency. Records were hidden, notes coded, and myths propagated to prevent ordinary people from accessing truths that could destabilize the social order. Anomalies, if explained, could empower curiosity, provoke rebellion, or inspire recognition of authority's fragility. Containment, therefore, was not just physical, it was epistemological. It was about ensuring that understanding remained the property of the few, that reality was filtered through the lens of institutional control. Her existence, paradoxically, challenged this control. The more observers documented, measured, and ritualized her anomaly, the more evidence accumulated that could not be fully suppressed. Even in the fragments that survive, there is proof that systems fail when confronted with phenomena that exceed conventional categories. Knowledge cannot be completely contained. It leaks, seeps through cracks in myth, and persists in memory. Her life became a cautionary tale of this delicate tension between power and truth. The lesson extends beyond history. Every institution, every social structure, every authority that claims expertise operates on the same principle. Control knowledge, control perception, control reality. And anomalies, whether in nature, society, or thought, are always managed with fear, fascination, and selective disclosure. Recognizing this is the first step toward autonomy. Awareness of hidden information hierarchies is the beginning of resisting manipulation. Her story teaches that the preservation and interpretation of knowledge is a battlefield. The anomaly persists not just as a physical phenomenon, but as a symbol of intellectual and psychological resistance. It reminds us that truth exists independently of the systems attempting to suppress it, and that vigilance, observation, and discernment are tools to reclaim what is obscured. The rituals and symbols surrounding her anomaly were not arbitrary. They were precise, methodical, and designed to interact with forces that science and religion could not fully explain. Priests invoked phrases from esoteric traditions. Doctors performed repeated measures in patterns that resembled ceremonial rites more than medical examinations, and objects were placed strategically around her home. Every act served a dual purpose: observation and containment, testing and control. These rituals operated on multiple levels. Outwardly, they appeared as attempts at healing, blessing, or scientific measurement. But beneath the surface, they functioned as instruments of authority, shaping perception, influencing her environment, and attempting to channel or suppress the anomaly itself. Symbols traced on floors, objects arranged according to arcane principles, and carefully timed procedures were all part of a systematic attempt to manage what could not be explained. The psychological dimension of these rituals is critical. Those performing them were asserting dominance, attempting to structure reality in a way that maintained the illusion of comprehension. Their fear and fascination are evident in the surviving fragments, meticulous notes, coded journals, and repeated instructions to local witnesses to avoid inquiry. Every step was calculated to reinforce the hierarchy between observer and anomaly, to ensure that authority retained control over perception even as the anomaly persisted beyond expectation. But rituals are never neutral. They influence not only the observed but also the observer. By performing these acts, the authority figures became participants in a system they did not fully understand, complicit in the very forces they sought to dominate. Their own perceptions were altered, their assumptions challenged, and their control tested by the persistence of the anomaly. In this way, her presence transformed the power dynamic. She was simultaneously observed, studied, and subtly influencing those who sought mastery over her. This is the hidden lesson. When confronted with phenomena beyond comprehension, authority will resort to ritual, symbolism, and structured observation to maintain control. Yet these methods, while outwardly asserting dominance, also expose the fragility and limits of that control. The anomaly endures not just physically but conceptually, demonstrating that persistence and subtle influence are forms of power even in the face of overwhelming authority.